The notification chimed at 2:47 a.m., and Sarah's phone lit up the bedroom like a small lighthouse. She reached for it faster than she'd ever reached for me, fingers already moving across the screen before her eyes were fully open. The blue glow painted her face in shadows I didn't recognize. I pretended to sleep, but sleep had abandoned me weeks ago, somewhere between the late-night work calls that sounded more like whispers and the way she'd started charging her phone in the kitchen instead of on her nightstand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I fix things for a living, air conditioning systems mostly, in Phoenix where the heat doesn't take summers off and neither do I. 22 years in the trade taught me that problems announce themselves quietly before they scream. A slight hum in the compressor, a bearing that's running just a degree too warm. You learn to listen with more than your ears. That Thursday morning in September, our kitchen felt like a crime scene where nothing had been stolen yet. Sarah moved through her routine with the precision of someone following a script. Coffee in the travel mug with the chip on the handle, toast buttered to the exact same coverage, phone tucked into her purse like a secret she was protecting. She kissed my cheek on her way out, the same spot, the same pressure, but her lips felt rehearsed. Our daughter Emma bounced into the kitchen wearing her soccer uniform and a grin that could power the whole subdivision. She was 13, that perfect age where the world still made sense and parents were heroes instead of people pretending they had answers. She grabbed a granola bar and asked if I'd make it to her game Saturday. I told her nothing could keep me away. She hugged me with sticky fingers and ran to catch the bus. The house went quiet in that way houses do when they're holding their breath. I drank my coffee standing at the counter, watching Sarah's coffee ring still drying on the granite. We'd picked out that granite together 3 years ago, spent a Saturday morning at the showroom running our hands over samples, debating patterns like they mattered. And how it felt like evidence of a time when we still made decisions as a team. I finished my coffee, grabbed my work bag, and tried not to notice that Sarah had forgotten to say goodbye to Emma. The Hernandez house needed a new unit, and Mrs. Hernandez needed someone to listen while she explained why the old one had been making sounds like a dying walrus. I nodded in the right places, made notes, and quoted her a price that wouldn't hurt her fixed income. While I worked, my mind kept wandering back to Sarah's phone and the way she'd started taking it everywhere, even to the bathroom. Phones don't need that much attention unless they're giving it to someone else. By lunch, I'd replaced the condenser and restored peace to the Hernandez household. Mrs. Hernandez made me a sandwich and told me about her late husband, how he used to fix everything himself until arthritis made his hands shake too much to hold tools steady. She said the hardest part wasn't losing him, it was losing the sound of his projects, the way confidence sounded when it wore work boots. I understood that better than I wanted to. That evening, Sarah came home with takeout from the Thai place we used to go to for anniversaries. She apologized for being distant lately, blamed work stress and the upcoming quarterly reports. Her smile looked expensive, the kind that cost effort to maintain. She asked about my day, and I told her about Mrs. Hernandez and the sandwich and the stories about marriage that lasted 53 years. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were elsewhere, probably checking the time, calculating when she could politely check her phone again. Emma dominated dinner with play-by-play analysis of soccer practice and complaints about algebra. Sarah laughed at the right moments, asked follow-up questions, played the part of engaged mother with Oscar-worthy commitment. But when Emma mentioned needing cleats for the tournament, Sarah's response came half a beat too late, like she was translating the conversation from another language. I made a mental note to take Emma shopping myself. After Emma went upstairs to wrestle with homework, Sarah and I cleaned dishes in the kind of silence married couples know. The comfortable kind had evaporated somewhere along the way, replaced by something that felt like waiting. She washed, I dried, and between us sat all the questions I wasn't ready to ask. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, then at me, then continued scrubbing a plate that was already clean. I wanted to ask who was texting at 9 p.m. on a Thursday. I wanted to ask why her work calls had started happening in the garage. I wanted to ask when she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring to bed. Instead, I dried the same glass twice and told myself that marriage was like air conditioning. Sometimes the system runs a little rough, but that doesn't mean it's broken. Sometimes it just needs attention. That night, I lay awake listening to Sarah breathe and trying to remember the last time we talked about something that mattered. Real conversation, not scheduling and logistics and who was picking up Emma from practice. The breathing beside me sounded different, shallower, like she was concentrating on seeming asleep. Her phone was charging in the kitchen again, and I wondered what conversations were happening in the dark while I stared at the ceiling. Friday brought the kind of heat that makes Phoenix feel personal, like the desert has a grudge against anyone foolish enough to live there. I had 3 service calls scheduled, all emergency visits because air conditioning isn't optional when the thermometer hits 115. The first house belonged to an elderly couple who'd been rationing cool air to save money. The husband had heat exhaustion, the wife was crying. I fixed their unit for cost and threw in a new filter because some things matter more than profit margins. Between calls, I found myself thinking about patterns. In my work, patterns tell stories. A system that's running too hard, a thermostat that's lying about the temperature, a filter that's been ignored until it can't breathe. I'd started noticing patterns at home too, small changes that added up to something I couldn't name yet. Sarah's laugh had gotten brighter and more frequent, but never around me. Her wardrobe had gotten more careful, like she was dressing for someone who paid attention. Her phone had become an extension of her hand. The second service call was at a new subdivision where the houses all looked like they'd been photocopied from the same magazine. The homeowner, a man about my age wearing a golf shirt that cost more than I made in a day, complained that his smart thermostat wasn't smart enough. I wanted to tell him that intelligence wasn't something you could buy and install, but I fixed his settings and took his check without comment. Some people think money solves problems, others think it creates them. By the time I reached the third call, my shirt was soaked and my patience was running on fumes. The house belonged to a young couple with a new baby, and a system that had picked the worst possible day to quit. I worked fast, bypassing a failed capacitor with a temporary fix that would hold until I could return with parts. The father shook my hand like I'd saved Christmas. The mother offered me ice water and thanked me 3 times. They reminded me of Sarah and me 10 years ago, when problems had simple solutions and gratitude came naturally. That evening, Emma had plans with friends, which left Sarah and me alone for the first time in weeks. She suggested we watch a movie, something we used to do every Friday night before life got complicated. We settled on the couch with the careful distance of people who used to know how to touch each other. She chose a romantic comedy that felt like mockery given our current climate. I pretended to pay attention while actually watching her watch her phone. The phone sat on the coffee table between us like a third person we were both trying to ignore. It buzzed twice during the opening credits, once during the first act, 3 times during what was supposed to be the romantic climax. Each time, Sarah's eyes flicked toward it with the hunger of someone checking a slot machine. Each time, she forced herself to look back at the screen. Each time, the effort showed more. When the credits rolled, she yawned with theatrical precision and announced she was tired. She kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more like a bookmark than affection, and headed upstairs. I stayed on the couch, listening to her move through the bedtime routine that used to include me. Water running, drawer opening and closing, the soft sound of her voice, but not talking to me, talking to someone, somewhere, through a screen that had become more intimate than our marriage bed. I waited until the house settled into its night rhythm before I walked through the rooms we'd filled with 15 years of shared decisions. Wedding photos smiled at me from tables and walls, frozen moments when we'd believed in forever with the confidence of people who'd never been tested. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator like prayers for a childhood that was slipping away faster than I wanted to admit. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the Thai food Sarah had brought home, an apology dinner for sins I couldn't name yet. Saturday morning arrived with the promise of Emma's soccer game and the first real cold front Phoenix had seen in months. I made pancakes, Emma's Saturday tradition, and called upstairs to announce breakfast. Emma appeared immediately, hair wild from sleep, wearing the team jersey that was already too small, but she refused to replace. Sarah appeared 10 minutes later, phone in hand, apologizing for sleeping through her alarm. Emma chattered about the game, about strategy and who was likely to play where and which parents would embarrass themselves on the sidelines. Sarah smiled and nodded, but her responses came from muscle memory rather than attention. Her phone buzzed, she ignored it, it buzzed again. She glanced at it, then at me, then put it face down on the table. Emma asked if both parents would be there to watch. Sarah said yes, but looked at her phone when she said it.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The soccer complex was a monument to suburban hope, 8 fields of artificial grass where dreams were born and died every weekend. I carried the folding chairs while Sarah carried her purse with her phone buried inside like a secret. Emma ran off to warm up with her teammates, all of them moving with the fearless energy of kids who believed their bodies would never betray them. Sarah and I found spots on the sideline and unfolded our chairs in the careful choreography of parents who'd done this dozens of times. The game started well. Emma played midfielder, orchestrating plays with the vision of someone who understood that soccer was really about making space for other people to succeed. Sarah cheered at the right moments, took pictures with the deliberate enthusiasm of someone performing motherhood for an audience, but her phone kept buzzing inside her purse and each buzz made her flinch like someone was calling her name from another room. Halftime brought the usual chaos of orange slices and water bottles and coaches trying to motivate 13-year-olds with speeches they'd learned from movies. Sarah excused herself to use the restroom, taking her purse with her. I watched her walk toward the building, then detour toward the parking lot, phone already in her hand before she was out of earshot. She stood between two SUVs, pacing in small circles, talking to someone who was making her smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. Emma jogged over, sweaty and glowing with the satisfaction of a first half played well. She asked where Mom had gone. I told her the restroom. Emma asked if everything was okay between us, that careful question kids ask when they sense adult weather changing. I told her everything was fine, that adults sometimes just needed to handle work stuff. Emma nodded, but her eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd learned to read the spaces between words. The second half was a blur of action and anxiety. Emma scored the winning goal with 3 minutes left, a perfect shot that found the corner of the net like it had been planned by GPS. The team celebrated. The parents cheered. Sarah returned just in time to see Emma pointing at us, making sure we'd witnessed her moment of glory. Sarah's smile was real then, uncomplicated by whatever conversation had been happening in the parking lot. After the game we took Emma for ice cream, a tradition that started when she was 7 and learned to take comfort from victory and defeat equally. She ordered the same flavor she always ordered, cookies and cream in a waffle cone, and told us about every play like we hadn't been watching. Sarah listened with the kind of attention that felt precious because it was becoming rare. Her phone stayed in her purse. For 30 minutes we were a family again. But driving home I caught Sarah checking her phone at red lights. Quick glances like someone monitoring vital signs. When we pulled into our driveway she was already calculating how quickly she could disappear into whatever conversation was waiting for her. Emma hugged us both and ran inside to call her friends and relive the game from angles we hadn't considered. Sarah followed her in, but headed straight for the kitchen where her charger lived. That afternoon, while Sarah took a call on the back patio and Emma video chatted with teammates, I found myself in our bedroom staring at the space where Sarah's phone used to charge every night. The outlet looked abandoned, like furniture in a house where people had moved out but forgotten to change the address. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 15 years and tried to remember the last time we'd made love, really made love, not just gone through the motions of married people with a schedule to keep. The house felt different now, like a place where secrets lived. Sarah's laughter drifted in from the patio, bright and musical and aimed at someone who wasn't me. Emma's voice carried down the hallway, full of the confidence that comes from being loved unconditionally. I sat between them, the man who fixed things for a living, surrounded by problems I didn't know how to diagnose. Sunday brought church, another tradition we'd maintained more from habit than faith. Emma sang in the children's choir, her voice clear and strong in ways that made my chest tight with pride. Sarah sat beside me in the pew, physically present but spiritually elsewhere. Her phone was on silent, but I could see it lighting up inside her purse, each notification pulling her attention away from the service and toward whatever salvation she was seeking in pixels and data. The pastor spoke about trust, about the foundation of faith being built on promises kept and words honored. I tried to listen, tried to find wisdom that might apply to marriages as well as spiritual relationships. But my mind kept wandering to patterns, to small changes that had become large distances. Sarah's hand rested in her lap, inches from mine but separated by what felt like continents of unspoken truth. After church, we went to brunch at the place we'd discovered when Emma was little, where they made pancakes shaped like cartoon characters and the waitresses remembered customers' names. Emma ordered the same thing she'd been ordering for 3 years. Sarah and I ordered coffee and pretended to study menus we'd memorized. The conversation felt scripted, safe topics that couldn't accidentally reveal anything important. Sarah's phone buzzed against the table. She apologized and checked it quickly, then longer, then typed a response with the speed of someone who'd had practice. Emma asked if it was work. Sarah said yes, but her smile suggested otherwise. I ate eggs that tasted like cardboard and wondered when my family had become a performance we were all tired of giving. That afternoon, Emma went to a birthday party, which left Sarah and me alone again. She suggested we tackle the garage, a project we'd been discussing for months. We spent 2 hours sorting through boxes of Christmas decorations and camping equipment we never used. It felt good to work together, to move toward a common goal without conversation getting in the way. But even in the garage, her phone found reasons to interrupt, text messages that made her step outside, calls that couldn't wait until we were finished. By evening I'd made a decision that felt as heavy as the air conditioning units I installed for a living. I waited until Sarah was in the shower, until the sound of running water would cover any noise I might make. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, charging and unguarded for the first time in weeks. My hands shook as I picked it up, not from fear but from the knowledge that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The lock screen showed 17 unread messages from a contact labeled simply as M. 17 conversations I wasn't part of, 17 moments when someone else had been more important than the family sitting in the same room. I set the phone down without reading them, but the number burned in my mind like a brand. 17 reasons why my wife had been living somewhere else while her body stayed home. The water stopped running upstairs. I moved away from the counter, away from the phone that held answers I wasn't ready to hear. Sarah came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair damp, wearing the pajamas that used to mean invitation but now just meant bedtime. She checked her phone immediately, smiled at whatever she found there, then looked at me with the guilty expression of someone who'd been caught thinking about someone else. That night I lay awake again, but this time with purpose instead of just insomnia. 17 messages. A contact named M, a wife who'd started living in her phone instead of our house. Patterns were forming, and like any system that was running wrong, the first step toward fixing it was understanding exactly how it was broken. I made a decision that would have scared the man I used to be. I was going to find out who M was and what 17 messages had to say about the messages I thought I was still living. Monday morning felt like the beginning of something, though I couldn't say whether it was an ending or a discovery. Sarah left early for a breakfast meeting she hadn't mentioned before. Emma caught the bus with her usual chaos of forgotten homework and hurried hugs. I stood in our kitchen, drinking coffee and staring at the granite countertop that had witnessed 15 years of ordinary mornings, and realized that nothing would ever be ordinary again. I'd built my life on the principle that problems announced themselves if you knew how to listen. Now I was hearing static in the system I'd trusted most. The question wasn't whether something was wrong. The question was whether I was ready to learn how wrong it was, and what I was prepared to do about it once I knew. The phone that had become a stranger in our house held answers I needed and truths I dreaded. 17 messages were waiting to tell me a story I'd never wanted to hear. But some stories demand to be heard, especially when they're being written in your own house, by people you love, in languages you're still learning to understand. I finished my coffee, grabbed my work bag, and headed out to fix other people's problems while mine waited patiently for me to find the courage to face them. The day was already hot, and it was going to get hotter before it cooled down. The Morrison house had a condenser unit that sounded like it was grinding glass, and Mrs. Morrison had the patience of someone who'd raised 4 teenagers in the Arizona heat without central air. I diagnosed the problem in 10 minutes but spent an hour listening to her theories about what might be wrong. She made iced tea while I worked, and we talked about everything except the reason I kept checking my phone every few minutes. Sarah had left for another breakfast meeting, the third one this month, with people whose names I never heard at dinner. Emma was at school, probably solving algebra problems with the same methodical approach I used to troubleshoot HVAC systems. Everything had a logical explanation if you knew where to look. The challenge was wanting to see what the logic revealed. Mrs. Morrison's neighbor leaned over the fence to complain about the noise the old unit had been making. I listened to both women discuss the situation like diplomats negotiating territory, finding common ground in shared annoyance and mutual respect. They'd been neighbors for 23 years through divorces and remarriages and grandchildren and loss. They had the ease of people who'd weathered real storms together. I envied that kind of history, the trust that came from seeing someone's worst moments and choosing to stay anyway. The new compressor hummed to life with the satisfied sound of machinery doing what it was designed to do. Morrison paid me with cash and a plate of cookies wrapped in aluminum foil. She asked about Emma's soccer season and Sarah's work and whether we were planning any vacations. Normal questions that people asked when they assumed you were living a normal life. I gave normal answers and drove away feeling like a fraud. My next appointment was at a new subdivision where every house looked identical except for the mailbox numbers. The homeowner was a software engineer who worked from home and needed his office to stay exactly 72 degrees or his productivity suffered. He showed me graphs on his laptop that tracked temperature fluctuations over the past 6 months. Everything documented, measured, analyzed. I respected the thoroughness even if I found the obsession unsettling. While I worked on his system, he explained his monitoring setup. Sensors throughout the house feeding data to his computer, alerts when anything moved outside acceptable parameters. He could track patterns, identify problems before they became failures. It was impressive and slightly disturbing, the way he'd turned his home into a laboratory where everything was measured and nothing was trusted to work properly without surveillance. I thought about patterns while I calibrated his thermostat, the way Sarah's routine had shifted over the past few months. Later mornings, earlier evenings, gaps in her schedule that hadn't existed before, the way her phone had migrated from the bedroom to the kitchen to being permanently attached to her hand. Small changes that might mean nothing individually, but added up to something larger when you stepped back and looked at the whole system. The engineer paid me with a credit card and asked if I wanted to see his energy usage data, charts showing exactly how much electricity each appliance consumed, down to the minute. I politely declined, but his dedication to knowing everything about his environment stayed with me as I drove to my next call. Some people needed to understand every variable to feel safe, others preferred to trust that things would work until they didn't. Lunch was a sandwich eaten in my truck outside a strip mall parked next to a cell phone repair shop that advertised data recovery services. I watched people walk in and out, carrying devices that held their entire lives, photos, messages, contacts, secrets. Amazing how much of ourselves we carried around in 6 inches of glass and metal. Amazing how much damage could be done when those devices started talking to the wrong people. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah asking if I could pick up Emma from school because her afternoon meeting was running long. Another meeting I hadn't heard about with people whose faces I'd never seen. I replied that I'd handle it, no problem. Taking care of Emma was never a problem. Understanding why her mother's schedule had become so complicated was the challenge. Emma was waiting outside the school with her backpack and a frown, surrounded by friends who were laughing about something that apparently wasn't funny to her. She climbed into the truck with the dramatic sigh that 13-year-olds had perfected long before they learned to drive. I asked about her day, and she launched into a detailed analysis of why her history teacher's grading system was fundamentally unfair and how her friend Madison was being weird about something nobody wanted to explain. I listened to her work through social dynamics that seemed infinitely more complex than any HVAC system I'd ever diagnosed. Middle school was apparently a place where alliances shifted daily and the rules changed without notice. Emma navigated it all with a combination of frustration and fascination that reminded me why I'd never wanted to be 13 again. She asked where Mom was and I explained about the meeting that was running long. Emma nodded but didn't comment, which meant she'd noticed the pattern too. Kids were excellent at detecting changes in routine, even when adults thought they were being subtle. Emma had started asking fewer questions about Sarah's schedule, which probably meant she'd stopped expecting answers that made complete sense. We stopped for ice cream on the way home, another Tuesday tradition that had evolved from Emma's need for something predictable in a world that kept shifting around her. She ordered mint chocolate chip and told me about her upcoming science project, something involving renewable energy and solar panels. I offered to help with the technical aspects, and she accepted with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed learning how things worked. At home, Emma disappeared upstairs to tackle homework while I paid bills and tried to make sense of our household budget. Sarah's expenses had increased recently, small charges for things I didn't recognize, coffee shops I'd never heard of, parking fees for areas where she didn't usually work, online purchases from companies that specialized in things we didn't need. Nothing dramatic, just a steady increase in spending that felt like someone was living a parallel life. I made dinner while Sarah attended another phone call in the backyard, pacing the length of our patio while she talked to someone who made her laugh. Emma set the table without being asked and filled water glasses with the competence of someone who'd learned to anticipate family needs. We were becoming a household where everyone managed their own responsibilities without much coordination. Sarah joined us for dinner with apologies and explanations about client demands and project deadlines. She asked Emma about school and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone making up for lost time. The conversation felt carefully managed, like everyone was performing their role in a family that existed more in memory than in present reality. After dinner, Emma went upstairs to continue her homework battle while Sarah disappeared into the home office to answer emails. I cleaned the kitchen and found myself studying Sarah's charging station, a small corner of counter where her phone lived when it wasn't traveling with her. The phone wasn't there, which meant it was wherever Sarah was, ready to connect her to conversations that didn't include her husband or daughter. I finished the dishes and decided to do something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I opened our cell phone account online and looked at the usage reports, the digital footprint of our family's communication habits. Emma's phone showed texts to friends and calls to us, exactly what you'd expect from a responsible teenager. My phone showed work calls and family messages, a predictable pattern of someone whose social life was mostly professional. Sarah's phone told a different story. Hundreds of text messages to numbers I didn't recognize, phone calls that lasted longer than business calls usually did, data usage that suggested someone was sharing photos and videos with people who weren't family. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it, like reading a diagnostic report from a system that was working fine except for one component that was running way outside normal parameters. I printed the usage report and studied it like a schematic, looking for patterns in timing and frequency. Most of the unknown activity happened during business hours, which explained why Sarah had become so protective of her work time. But some of it happened in the evenings, while we were all in the same house pretending to be a family that still talked to each other about things that mattered. One number appeared more frequently than the others, a 602 area code that meant local Phoenix. Hundreds of texts and dozens of calls spread across the past 3 months, concentrated mainly during weekdays but scattered throughout weekends too. The data usage was substantial, suggesting photos and videos were being shared regularly. I stared at the number until it was memorized, then folded the paper and put it in my wallet next to Emma's school photos. That night, Sarah came to bed later than usual, claiming she'd been finishing a presentation for tomorrow's client meeting. She kissed my forehead and turned toward the wall, settling into sleep with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to avoid conversation. I lay awake listening to her breathe and thinking about data usage reports and phone numbers and the difference between privacy and secrecy. Wednesday morning brought a heat wave that had the local news stations competing to see who could sound most apocalyptic about temperatures that were normal for Phoenix in October. I had 4 emergency service calls before noon, all from people whose air conditioning systems had decided they'd rather surrender than fight the heat. I spent the morning replacing capacitors and cleaning coils and explaining to frustrated homeowners that machines, like people, sometimes needed more attention when they were under stress. Between calls, I found myself thinking about the phone number I'd memorized from Sarah's usage report. It would be easy enough to research, to find out who owned that particular combination of digits. The question was whether I was ready to know what the research would reveal. Some discoveries couldn't be undiscovered, and some knowledge changed everything whether you wanted it to or not. My third service call was at a mansion in Scottsdale where the homeowner had 4 separate AC units and a wine cellar that required its own climate control system. He complained about the electric bill while I worked on a system that could cool most people's entire houses. I wanted to explain that luxury came with costs, but I focused on the mechanical problems and left the philosophical ones alone. The homeowner paid me with a check and asked if I knew anyone who did home security systems. He was convinced someone was monitoring his property, possibly his wife's attorney since they were in the middle of a divorce. He wanted cameras and motion sensors and alarms that would detect any unauthorized surveillance. I told him I fixed air conditioning, not marriages, but I understood his need to know who was watching and why. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I called the 602 number from Sarah's phone records, not to confront anyone but just to hear the voice that answered. My hands shook as I dialed and my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape the situation entirely. The phone rang twice before a man's voice answered with a casual hello that suggested he was expecting someone else to call. I hung up without speaking, but the voice stayed with me for the rest of the day. Deep, confident, younger than mine. The voice of someone who laughed easily and expected good things to happen. I tried to imagine Sarah talking to that voice, sharing jokes and secrets and pieces of herself that she no longer shared with me. The picture that formed in my mind was more painful than I'd expected. Emma's soccer practice that evening provided a welcome distraction from my own thoughts. I sat in the bleachers with other parents, watching our daughters run drills and scrimmage while we made small talk about schedules and carpool arrangements. The other parents seemed to exist in a world where families were stable and predictable, where the biggest concerns were tournament schedules and whether someone could provide snacks for Saturday's game. Sarah arrived halfway through practice, apologizing to the other parents for being late because of work. She sat beside me and asked how Emma was playing, and I pointed out our daughter's improved passing and positioning. For 20 minutes we were able to focus on something we both loved unconditionally, watching Emma develop skills and confidence that would serve her long after soccer season did. After practice, Emma wanted to stop for smoothies, and Sarah suggested we make it a family outing. We sat at a picnic table outside the smoothie shop, and Emma dominated the conversation with detailed analysis of practice and predictions about Saturday's game. Sarah and I nodded and asked follow-up questions, playing our roles as interested parents while carefully avoiding any topic that might lead to questions about why we seemed more like co-workers than spouses. Emma asked if we could do something fun this weekend, maybe go hiking or visit the Science Museum. Sarah and I exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to mention prior commitments or scheduling conflicts. I said hiking sounded great, and Sarah agreed, though she mentioned she might need to check her work calendar. Emma beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully negotiated a family adventure. That night, after Emma was asleep, and Sarah was taking her usual extended shower, I sat in the living room with my laptop and typed the phone number into a reverse lookup website. The results came back immediately. Michael Torres, age 34, employed by a marketing firm downtown. His social media profiles showed a man who looked like he spent time in gyms and expensive restaurants, someone who wore suits that fit properly and drove cars that didn't need repairs. I stared at his photos for longer than was healthy, trying to understand what Sarah saw in this stranger that she didn't see in the man she'd married 15 years ago. Michael Torres looked like success, like someone who made decisions instead of repairing other people's mistakes. He looked like everything I wasn't, which probably explained everything I needed to know about why Sarah's phone had become more important than her family. The shower stopped running upstairs, which meant Sarah would be down soon to collect her phone and disappear into whatever conversation was waiting for her. I closed the laptop and put it away, but Michael Torres's face stayed with me like a song you can't stop humming. Now I had a name and a face to go with the phone number, which meant the situation had moved from suspicion to certainty. The question was what I intended to do with that certainty. Thursday brought relief from the heat wave and a service call that would change everything. The address was for a high-rise downtown, expensive apartments with views of the mountains and rent that cost more than most people's mortgages. I loaded my equipment and drove through traffic that moved like it was underwater, fighting the morning commute that defined Phoenix for anyone who worked regular hours. The apartment belonged to a woman named Jennifer who worked from home and needed her AC fixed before a video conference with clients in New York. She was professional and efficient, offering coffee while I diagnosed her system and explaining her schedule without making it sound like a complaint. The problem was simple, a clogged drain line that had caused the unit to shut down automatically. I fixed it in 30 minutes and tested the system to make sure it would hold. While I worked, Jennifer mentioned that her neighbor in 4B had been having similar problems with his unit. She offered to call him to see if he wanted to schedule service while I was in the building. The neighbor's name was Michael, and he worked in marketing, and yes, he was definitely interested in having someone look at his AC before it failed completely during the next heat wave. I knew before the elevator reached the 4th floor that I was about to meet the man whose voice I'd heard on the phone, whose face I'd studied on social media, whose existence had been slowly dismantling my marriage for the past 3 months. I knocked on apartment 4B with steady hands and a heart that felt like it was trying to drill through my chest. When the door opened, Michael Torres stood there in person looking exactly like his photos except more real and somehow more threatening. He was everything the photos had suggested, tall, confident, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than I spent on work clothes in a month. He welcomed me into his apartment with the easy charm of someone who was used to people saying yes to whatever he wanted. The apartment was immaculate, furnished with the kind of taste that required both money and attention to detail. Everything looked like it belonged in a magazine, including the man who lived there. Michael's AC unit was running fine, which became obvious as soon as I started my diagnostic routine. He admitted he'd mostly wanted to meet me because Jennifer had mentioned I did good work and he liked to know reliable service providers. We made small talk about the building and the heat and the challenges of maintaining comfort in desert climates. He was easy to talk to, the kind of person who remembered names and asked follow-up questions about things you'd mentioned in passing. While I performed an unnecessary but thorough inspection of his system, Michael talked about his work in marketing, his clients, his travel schedule. He mentioned that he was recently single, that his last relationship had ended when she moved back east for family reasons. He said he was enjoying the bachelor life but missed having someone to share experiences with. The comment felt loaded, like he was testing how much I knew about his current situation. I finished the inspection and gave him my business card, playing the role of helpful contractor while my mind processed the reality of standing in the apartment where my wife probably spent time when her schedule had mysterious gaps. Michael paid me in cash and asked if I had a regular maintenance schedule for commercial clients. I told him I mostly worked residential but would be happy to recommend someone for his office building. He walked me to the door and thanked me for the thorough work, shaking my hand with the grip of someone who understood the value of making good impressions. As the elevator carried me back down to the parking garage, I tried to reconcile the polite professional man I'd just met with the person who was systematically destroying my family. Michael Torres seemed decent, which somehow made everything worse. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes before starting the engine, staring up at the building where Michael lived and wondering how many times Sarah had made this same drive, coming here instead of coming home. The parking garage was full of expensive cars, the kind that suggested the residents could afford whatever they wanted without checking their bank accounts first. Sarah's Lexus would fit right in, just another successful professional visiting someone who could give her things I couldn't. The drive home took forever, every red light giving me more time to think about what I'd discovered and what it meant for Emma and me. I'd confirmed what I'd already suspected, but confirmation felt different than suspicion. Heavier, more permanent. I could have spent months wondering who Em was and whether my marriage was really in trouble. Now I knew both answers, and the knowing felt like carrying a weight I couldn't put down. That evening Sarah came home with takeout from an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where they gave you cloth napkins and the portions were small but beautifully arranged. She said she'd been craving good food after a long day of meetings, but she didn't mention having been near any restaurants that served food this expensive. Emma was thrilled with the fancy pasta and asked if we were celebrating something special. Sarah said we were celebrating making it through another week, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. We ate dinner by candlelight, Sarah having found tapered candles in a drawer and decided the meal deserved proper presentation. Emma talked about her upcoming science project and asked for help with research about renewable energy sources. I offered to help her understand the technical aspects while Sarah could help with presentation and organization. After dinner, Sarah suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done as a family in weeks. Emma chose a comedy that made us all laugh, and for 90 minutes we managed to be the family we used to be. Sarah sat between Emma and me on the couch, sharing popcorn and making comments about the ridiculous plot. Her phone stayed in the kitchen and her attention stayed in the room with us. When the movie ended, Emma hugged us both goodnight and headed upstairs to finish homework and call friends. Sarah and I cleaned up the living room together, folding the throw blankets and putting away the popcorn bowl. She thanked me for being patient with her busy schedule lately, and I told her I understood that work could be demanding. Neither of us mentioned that her work schedule had become impossible to track or that she'd started living more in her phone than in our house. That night Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted by whatever demands were requiring so much of her energy. I lay awake thinking about Michael Torres and his polite handshake and his apartment that looked like a showroom for successful living. I thought about Sarah driving there after dropping Emma at school, spending hours in a place where she could be someone other than a wife and mother with responsibilities that never took a day off. I understood the appeal even as it broke my heart. Michael's life looked uncomplicated, full of choices rather than obligations. His apartment was clean because he paid someone to clean it, not because he spent weekends scrubbing bathrooms and vacuuming stairs. His schedule was his own, shaped by professional ambitions rather than soccer practice and parent-teacher conferences. He represented freedom from the thousand small compromises that defined family life. but understanding the appeal didn't make the betrayal easier to carry. Sarah had made promises to Emma and me, promises about building a life together and facing challenges as a team. Those promises hadn't included escape clauses for when better options presented themselves. They hadn't included provisions for conducting a double life funded by our family finances and built on lies about breakfast meetings and late office calls. Friday morning brought the decision I'd been avoiding all week. Emma left for school with her usual chaos of forgotten assignments and hurried goodbyes. Sarah left for another mysterious breakfast meeting with people whose names she couldn't quite remember when I asked for details. I waited until both of them were gone, then made a phone call that would either save my marriage or end it. I called Sarah's office and asked to speak with her, explaining that I was her husband and had a quick question about weekend plans. The receptionist was polite but confused, explaining that Sarah was out of the office on personal time and wouldn't be back until Monday. She offered to take a message, but I declined and hung up feeling like someone had punched me in the stomach. Sarah had been lying about where she spent her days, which meant everything else was probably a lie too. The breakfast meetings, the client calls, the work emergencies that required her immediate attention, all of it was cover for a life she was living somewhere else with someone else. I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee and staring at the calendar where we marked Emma's activities and family obligations, wondering how many of those commitments Sarah had been mentally checking out of while physically showing up. I called my boss and asked for the rest of the day off, explaining that I had a family emergency that needed my attention. It wasn't entirely a lie. Discovering that your wife had been living a fictional life for months qualified as an emergency in anyone's book. I spent the morning organizing everything I'd discovered, printing phone records and creating a timeline that showed the progression of Sarah's deception from occasional texts to daily phone calls to whatever was happening now. By lunchtime, I'd made another decision that scared me almost as much as the first one. I was going to follow Sarah's routine for one day to see where she actually went when she claimed to be at breakfast meetings and client calls. Not to confront her or cause a scene, but to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Some problems couldn't be fixed until you understood exactly how broken they were. The rest of Friday was spent preparing for surveillance that felt both necessary and sickening. I charged my phone, mapped routes between Michael's apartment and the places Sarah claimed to have meetings, and practiced the kind of patience that investigators needed when they were documenting behavior that would eventually matter in courtrooms and custody hearings. I wasn't ready to think about divorce lawyers and custody schedules, but I was beginning to understand that those conversations might be inevitable whether I wanted them or not. Monday morning arrived with the weight of decision. I'd spent the weekend watching Sarah perform the role of wife and mother with Academy Award precision, helping Emma with her science project and suggesting we plan a family vacation for Christmas. Every smile felt calculated, every touch choreographed. She was living in our house like an actress who'd been cast in a role she no longer wanted but couldn't figure out how to quit. I left for work before Sarah's alarm went off, parking 3 blocks from Michael's apartment building and waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned that the most important repairs required time and observation. At 8:47 a.m. Sarah's white Lexus pulled into the visitor parking section. She sat in her car for 2 minutes, checking her appearance in the mirror and typing something on her phone before walking toward the building entrance like she owned the place. She stayed for 3 hours and 14 minutes. I documented everything: arrival time, parking spot, the way she walked with purpose instead of hesitation. When she emerged at 12:01 p.m., her hair was different, her lipstick fresh, her smile the kind that came from being appreciated by someone who didn't know her well enough to take her for granted. She drove to a coffee shop downtown, ordered something complicated, and sat alone for 30 minutes typing messages that made her laugh out loud. That afternoon I installed a security system for a family whose teenage son had been breaking curfew and lying about his whereabouts. The parents wanted cameras and motion sensors, evidence that would help them understand what was happening when they weren't watching. I sympathized with their need to know the truth, even when the truth would be painful. Some problems couldn't be solved until they were fully understood. The father asked how I'd handle discovering that someone I trusted had been lying to me. I told him that trust, once broken, was like a motor that had thrown a bearing. You could try to rebuild it, but it would never run the same way again. Some damage was permanent, no matter how much effort you put into the repair. He nodded like someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it from someone else. That evening, Emma's soccer team had practice and I volunteered to take her while Sarah attended another mysterious work obligation. Emma was quiet during the drive, staring out the window with the expression of someone processing thoughts too complicated for her age. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she was worried about Mom, who seemed stressed about work lately. I told Emma that adults sometimes went through difficult periods, that work pressure could make people behave differently for a while. Emma asked if Mom's job was more important than our family. The question hit like a wrench to the chest, direct and impossible to answer honestly without destroying a 13-year-old's sense of security. I told her that family was always the most important thing, but sometimes adults made choices that were hard to understand. During practice, I sat in the bleachers with other parents and listened to conversations about ordinary problems, school fundraisers, vacation plans, whose turn it was to provide snacks for Saturday's game. Their concerns seemed manageable, fixable with calendar coordination and good communication. I envied their ability to focus on logistics instead of wondering whether their marriages were built on foundations that had been slowly eroding for months. Emma played well, her passes crisp and her positioning smart. She was developing the kind of field awareness that separated good players from great ones, the ability to see what was happening before it happened and position herself accordingly. I wished I'd inherited that skill for life instead of just soccer, the capacity to read situations accurately and respond before problems became disasters. After practice, Emma asked if we could stop for ice cream, just the two of us. We sat at a picnic table outside her favorite shop and she told me about a friend whose parents were getting divorced. The friend was angry and confused, bouncing between households that felt foreign even though they contained the same furniture. Emma asked if divorce always meant that kids had to choose sides, or if there was a way for families to change shape without breaking completely. I told her that every family was different, that some could weather storms that destroyed others. I told her that love didn't disappear just because circumstances changed, but sometimes it had to find new ways to express itself. Emma nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who was learning that the adult world was more complicated than anyone had prepared her for. That night Sarah came home with takeout from the restaurant near Michael's apartment, the same one she'd brought home the week before. She apologized for missing practice, claiming that a client crisis had required her immediate attention. Emma accepted the explanation with polite skepticism, the way kids learn to do when adults' stories stop making complete sense. After dinner, I waited until Emma was asleep before confronting the situation that had been consuming me for weeks. I found Sarah in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere. I set the printed phone records on the counter between us like evidence in a trial neither of us had asked to attend. Sarah's face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, anger, and finally resignation. She didn't deny what the records showed or try to explain them away with stories about work obligations. She sat down at the kitchen table and asked how long I'd known. I told her about the patterns I'd noticed, the investigation I'd conducted, the visit to Michael's apartment. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap like a student receiving a failing grade. When I finished explaining what I'd discovered, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally she said she hadn't planned for it to happen, that Michael had started as a client whose marketing firm needed HVAC consultation for their office renovation. One conversation had led to another, professional meetings had become personal lunches, and before she realized what was happening, she was living a double life that felt more real than the one she shared with me. She said Michael made her feel young again, interesting again, like someone with unlimited potential instead of someone whose best years were behind her. He didn't know her as the woman who argued about household budgets and carpooling schedules. To him she was successful and sophisticated, someone who deserved attention and appreciation. The comparison was implicit but clear. I represented responsibility and routine, while Michael represented possibility and escape. I asked about Emma, about the promises we'd made to each other and the family we'd built together. Sarah said she loved Emma more than anything, but she couldn't continue pretending to be happy in a marriage that felt like a job she'd outgrown. She wanted to be the kind of mother who was fulfilled and excited about life, not someone who went through the motions while secretly resenting the choices that had led her to suburban predictability. The conversation lasted until nearly midnight, circling through accusations and justifications and attempts to assign blame for problems that had probably been building for years. Sarah admitted that she'd been planning to ask for a separation, that she'd wanted to wait until after the holidays to minimize the impact on Emma. She'd been gathering courage while gathering evidence that our marriage was beyond repair. I asked if she wanted to try counseling, to see if we could rebuild what we'd lost. Sarah said she didn't think that was possible, that she'd already moved too far away emotionally to find her way back to where we'd started. She said Michael had offered her a future that felt hopeful instead of resigned, a chance to discover who she could become instead of remaining who she'd always been. The next morning, Sarah packed a suitcase and moved to an extended stay hotel while we figured out custody arrangements and legal procedures. Emma took the news with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd been preparing for bad news without realizing it. She asked if it was her fault, if there was something she could have done differently. I assured her that adult relationships failed for adult reasons, that her only job was to continue being the amazing person she was becoming. Within a week, Sarah had moved into Michael's apartment, trading our suburban house for downtown views and the kind of lifestyle that came with dual professional incomes and no responsibility for anyone under 18. She picked Emma up on Wednesday evenings and every other weekend, taking her to restaurants and activities that felt like special occasions because they happened so rare. Emma adjusted with the resilience that kids somehow find when their worlds reorganize around them. She missed having both parents in the same house, but she appreciated the focused attention she received during individual time with each of us. Her grades stayed strong, her soccer performance improved, and she developed the independence that came from learning to navigate between two different households with different rules and expectations. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly civil, probably because Sarah was eager to start her new life and I was too tired to fight about money and belongings. We sold the house and split the proceeds, agreed on joint custody with Emma spending slightly more time with me during the school year. Sarah got the Lexus and the nice furniture. I got the tools and the responsibility for Emma's daily routine. 6 months after Sarah moved out, I bought a smaller house in the same school district, close enough to Emma's friends that her social life didn't suffer from our family's reconstruction. Emma helped me paint her new bedroom and organize the kitchen, approaching the project with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that new didn't necessarily mean worse, just different. I started dating again tentatively at first, then with more confidence as I remembered what it felt like to talk to someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences. Emma approved of Lisa, a teacher at her school who understood the challenges of single parenting and didn't try to replace anyone in our family structure. She simply added her own warmth and perspective to our existing routine. Sarah and Michael got married in a small ceremony downtown, followed by a honeymoon in Europe that she documented extensively on social media. Emma was invited to the wedding and attended with grace, celebrating her mother's happiness while maintaining loyalty to both parents. She was learning to navigate complex emotions with wisdom that impressed the adults around her. A year after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Sarah asking if we could meet for coffee. She looked happy but tired, like someone who'd gotten what she wanted and discovered it required more energy to maintain than she'd expected. Michael was successful and attentive, but he also traveled frequently and worked long hours. The freedom she'd craved had turned into a different kind of isolation. She didn't ask to reconcile, and I wouldn't have agreed if she had. Too much had changed, too many promises had been broken. But she apologized for the deception and the pain she'd caused, acknowledging that there had been better ways to handle her dissatisfaction with our marriage. She asked about Emma, about my work, about whether I was happy. I told her I was learning to be content with a life that was simpler but more honest. Emma flourished in the new arrangement, spending summer weeks with Sarah and Michael in their downtown apartment, and the rest of the year with me in our house that felt more like home than the previous one ever had. She learned to appreciate different kinds of relationships, the steady reliability she had with me and the exciting unpredictability she experienced with her mother. Both had value, both taught her important lessons about love and commitment, and the choices people make when they think no one is watching. 2 years later, Emma was 15 and playing varsity soccer, her confidence on the field reflecting the resilience she'd developed off it. She'd learned that families could reconfigure without breaking, that love could survive changes in geography and living arrangements. She maintained close relationships with both parents while developing her own identity independent of our choices and mistakes. I watched her play in a tournament championship, cheering from the sidelines alongside Lisa and other families who'd found ways to support their kids despite complicated personal histories. Emma scored the winning goal in overtime, then ran to the fence where all her supporters were waiting. She hugged me first, then Sarah, then Michael, then Lisa, creating a receiving line of people who loved her in different ways but with equal intensity. The photo from that day sits on my desk at work, a reminder that some problems can't be fixed but they can be managed with grace and patience. Emma's smile in that picture shows someone who'd learned that love doesn't always look like what you expect, but it can still be real and valuable when it shows up in unexpected forms. Looking back, I understand that Sarah needed to discover who she could become when she wasn't defined by the roles she'd accepted at 25. Michael represented possibility in a way that our established relationship couldn't. I couldn't provide the excitement of the unknown because I was already known, categorized, taken for granted in ways that The betrayal still stings when I think about it directly, but it's balanced by gratitude for the life that emerged from the wreckage. Emma and I have a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect. Lisa brings joy and partnership without the complications of shared history that we're trying to forget. Sarah seems genuinely happy in her new life, which makes Emma's time with her more enjoyable for everyone involved. I still fix air conditioning systems for people whose homes have stopped working the way they're supposed to. The work is the same, but my approach has evolved. I listen more carefully to what people tell me about the symptoms they're experiencing. I ask more questions about when the problem started and what might have changed in their environment. I understand now that mechanical failures often have roots in neglect that accumulated over time, small issues that weren't addressed until they became major breakdowns. The most important lesson I learned from losing my marriage is that some relationships can be repaired and some can't, but all of them deserve honest assessment before you decide which category they belong in. Sarah and I probably could have saved our marriage if we'd been willing to have difficult conversations earlier, before she started looking for solutions in someone else's apartment. But we were both too comfortable with the assumption that love was enough to overcome any problem, that commitment meant never having to question whether we were growing in the same direction. Emma is applying to colleges now, choosing schools based on her own interests and ambitions rather than our family's geography or financial limitations. She's learned to make decisions for herself while considering the impact on people she loves. She's developed the emotional intelligence that comes from watching adults handle crisis with varying degrees of grace and maturity. The night before she left for her first college visit, Emma thanked me for handling the divorce the way I did, for protecting her from the worst of the adult drama, while still being honest about what was happening. She said she'd learned more about integrity from watching how I responded to betrayal than from any lecture about values I could have given her. That conversation was worth every difficult moment of the previous 3 years. This morning Emma called from her dorm room to tell me about her classes and her roommate and the soccer team she's trying out for. She sounded confident and excited, like someone who knew she could handle whatever challenges came her way. She asked about Lisa and my work and whether I was taking care of myself. At the end of the call she said she loved me and was proud to be my daughter. After hanging up I sat in the kitchen of the house. Emma helped me make into a home, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper and the kind of peaceful routine that comes from learning to appreciate what you have instead of mourning what you've lost. The morning light through the window was golden, promising another day of work that mattered and relationships that were built on truth instead of convenience. The phone in my pocket stayed quiet, holding only conversations with people who knew my real schedule and genuine priorities. No secrets, no deception, no double life requiring careful management of multiple stories. Just the simple complexity of authentic relationships with people who chose to be part of my actual life instead of an edited version designed for public consumption. Tonight Lisa and I will make dinner together and talk about our days, sharing details that matter and leaving out the ones that don't. Tomorrow I'll fix someone's air conditioning system and explain what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. This weekend, Emma will call to tell me about her first soccer practice and ask for advice about time management and homesickness. Next month Sarah will send pictures from her and Michael's anniversary trip, and I'll respond with genuine congratulations for their happiness. The life I'm living now is smaller than the one I planned at 25, but it's also more solid, built on foundations that won't shift when tested by time and temptation. Emma is launching her own life with confidence and values that will serve her well when she faces her own difficult choices. Lisa and I are building something together based on who we actually are instead of who we might become under different circumstances. Some stories end with dramatic reconciliation or spectacular revenge. This one ends with the quiet satisfaction of people who learned to tell the truth, even when it was painful, and built something better from the pieces that remained. The air conditioning systems I repair will eventually need maintenance again, but the relationships I've reconstructed are designed to last because they're based on reality instead of wishful thinking. 3 years have passed since the divorce was finalized, and I've learned that healing doesn't follow a schedule. Some days the past feels like ancient history, filed away in a mental folder marked lessons learned. Other days it surfaces unexpectedly, triggered by a song on the radio or the sight of a couple holding hands in the grocery store checkout line. Today was one of those unexpected days. Emma called during my lunch break, excited about making the dean's list her sophomore year and getting selected for the university's honors program in environmental engineering. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd learned early that setbacks could become stepping stones if you approached them with the right attitude. She asked about my weekend plans, and I told her Lisa and I were thinking about driving up to Sedona for a hiking trip. After hanging up, I sat in my truck outside the Martinez house where I'd just finished installing a new HVAC system, thinking about how proud I was of the young woman Emma was becoming. She'd chosen environmental engineering partly because of our conversations about renewable energy during her middle school science project, the one we'd worked on together during those first difficult months after Sarah moved out. Now she was designing sustainable systems that would help other families live more efficiently. The Martinez installation had been more complex than usual, requiring custom ductwork to accommodate their home's unique layout. Mr. Martinez was a retired teacher who asked detailed questions about energy efficiency and maintenance requirements. His wife brought me iced tea and told stories about their grandchildren who visited every summer. They reminded me of the kind of couple Emma might look up to someday, people who'd weathered decades together by choosing partnership over convenience. Mrs. Martinez asked about my family, the way customers sometimes do when they're trying to place you in the social landscape of their community. I told her about Emma's success in college and Lisa's work at the elementary school. She nodded approvingly and said it was nice to see a man who talked about the important people in his life with genuine affection. The comment stayed with me as I drove to my next appointment. The afternoon service call was at a house I'd worked on before, a young family whose toddler had learned to change the thermostat settings faster than his parents could keep up. The father greeted me with the exhausted smile of someone who'd been sleep-deprived for 2 years running.
The mother apologized for the chaos while wrestling a squirming child who was determined to help fix whatever might be broken. Watching them navigate the beautiful disaster of early parenthood, I remembered those days with Emma, when every minor crisis felt major and every small victory deserved celebration. Sarah and I had been a good team then, taking turns with midnight feedings and doctor appointments and the 1,000 small emergencies that defined life with a baby. We'd been united by the shared purpose of keeping our daughters safe and happy. The memory came without the sharp edge of pain that used to accompany thoughts of our early marriage. Time had softened the resentment into something more like nostalgia for people we used to be. Sarah and I had been different then, focused on building something together instead of protecting individual territories. The failure of our marriage didn't erase the fact that we'd succeeded at creating and raising an extraordinary daughter. That evening, Lisa came over for dinner, bringing groceries and a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on alcohol. She'd been promoted to assistant principal at her school, a recognition of her ability to connect with kids who needed extra support. We cooked together, moving around my kitchen with the ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms without trying to change them. Lisa asked about my day, and I told her about the Martinez family and their questions about energy efficiency. She shared stories from her school, including a breakthrough with a student who'd been struggling with anger issues related to his parents' divorce. We talked about work and Emma's latest achievements and our plans for the Sedona trip. The conversation flowed naturally, without the careful navigation that had characterized my last years with Sarah. After dinner, we sat on the back patio watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple that never got old, no matter how many Arizona evenings you'd witnessed. Lisa mentioned that her ex-husband had called earlier, asking if they could modify their custody arrangement for their son. She'd handled the conversation with calm professionalism, discussing logistics without reopening old wounds. I admired her ability to maintain cordial relationships with people who'd hurt her, to separate past disappointments from present necessities. She'd learned the same lesson I had, that healing required letting go of the need for other people to acknowledge their mistakes or apologize for their choices. Some closure had to be self-generated, created through your own decision to stop carrying anger that served no useful purpose. We talked about forgiveness, about the difference between excusing harmful behavior and choosing not to let it define your future. Lisa said she'd realized that staying angry with her ex-husband was like taking poison and expecting him to get sick. The anger hurt her more than it hurt him, and it certainly didn't benefit their son who needed both parents to function as adults capable of putting his needs first. That night, after Lisa went home, I found myself thinking about patterns again, not the kind that indicated mechanical failure, but the kind that revealed personal growth. 3 years ago I'd been consumed by the need to understand why Sarah had betrayed our marriage, to assign blame and seek justice for wounds that felt mortal. Now I could see that the betrayal had been a symptom of deeper problems we'd both been too comfortable to address. Sarah had felt trapped by the predictability of our routine, hungry for excitement and validation that our settled life couldn't provide. I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of marriage, paying bills, maintaining the house, supporting Emma's activities, that I'd stopped seeing Sarah as a person with her own dreams and frustrations. We'd become co-managers of a household instead of partners in a love story. The realization didn't excuse her deception or minimize the pain it had caused, but it helped explain how two people who'd once been crazy about each other had drifted so far apart. Marriage required more than good intentions and shared responsibilities. It needed continuous attention, regular reassessment, honest communication about needs that changed as people grew and evolved. Lisa and I talked regularly about our relationship, checking in with each other about satisfaction levels in areas that might need attention. We'd both learned from previous marriages that problems multiplied in silence, that assumptions could be more dangerous than conflicts. We practiced the kind of maintenance that prevented small issues from becoming major breakdowns. The next morning brought a service call that would test everything I'd learned about handling difficult situations with grace. The address was familiar, Michael's apartment building downtown. The work order came through my company's scheduling system, requesting emergency HVAC repair for apartment 4B. I could have asked my boss to send someone else, could have claimed a scheduling conflict or sudden illness. Instead, I loaded my truck and drove downtown, curious to see how 3 years had changed the man who'd once represented everything I wasn't. Michael answered the door looking older and more tired than I remembered. His hair was thinner, his expensive clothes a little less crisp. He recognized me immediately, his expression cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and resignation. He invited me in with the careful politeness of someone who understood that the situation was awkward for everyone involved. The apartment looked different, less pristine than it had during my first visit. Children's toys were scattered in one corner, and family photos covered surfaces that had once been carefully curated for adult sophistication. Michael explained that he and Sarah had been married for 2 years now, that Sarah's sister and her kids were visiting for the summer, overwhelming the apartment's climate control system. He was polite and professional, explaining the symptoms his AC unit was experiencing without making eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. I diagnosed the problem quickly, a clogged filter and dirty coils that were making the system work harder than necessary. Simple maintenance issues that could have been prevented with regular attention. While I worked, Michael hovered nearby, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. Finally, he asked how Emma was doing, whether she was still playing soccer, how I was handling the single father responsibilities. His questions seemed genuine, motivated by concern rather than curiosity or guilt. I answered honestly, telling him about Emma's success in college and her plans for environmental engineering. Michael nodded and said he'd heard good things from Sarah, that Emma spoke highly of me, and seemed well-adjusted despite the family upheaval. He paused, then added that he respected how I'd handled the divorce proceedings, that he knew the situation couldn't have been easy, but I'd prioritized Emma's well-being over personal grievances. The comment felt like an apology without being an explicit one. I finished the repair and tested the system to ensure it was running efficiently. Michael paid me with a credit card and asked if I had any maintenance recommendations for preventing future problems. I explained the importance of regular filter changes and annual tune-ups, the same advice I gave all my customers. He thanked me and walked me to the door, shaking my hand with genuine appreciation. As I waited for the elevator, I reflected on how different the encounter had been from what I'd imagined during those early months of anger and confusion. Michael wasn't the villain I'd constructed in my mind, just a man who'd fallen in love with someone else's wife, and made choices that had complicated consequences for everyone involved. He seemed to understand the weight of those consequences, the ongoing responsibility he'd accepted when he chose to pursue a married woman with a child. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped out, carrying shopping bags and wearing the kind of casual clothes that suggested she'd been running errands rather than attending business meetings. She stopped short when she saw me, her expression flickering through the same sequence Michael's had: surprise, embarrassment, resignation. We stood there for a moment, two people who'd once shared everything now trying to navigate a chance encounter that neither of us had prepared. Sarah asked how I was doing, how the business was going, whether Lisa was well. I answered politely, reciprocating with questions about her work and her adjustment to married life in the city. The conversation felt surreal, like running lines from a play neither of us had auditioned for. She looked happy but tired, like someone who was living the life she'd wanted but discovering it required more energy than she'd anticipated. She mentioned that Emma had told her about my plans to expand the business, possibly hiring additional technicians and taking on commercial contracts. Sarah said she was proud of my success, that she'd always known I had the potential to grow beyond residential service calls. The comment felt generous, an acknowledgement of possibilities she'd never encouraged during our marriage. Gear farted. I told her about Emma's Dean's List achievement and her selection for the honors program. Sarah's face lit up with genuine pride and excitement, the kind of maternal joy that transcended personal complications. She said Emma called her regularly, sharing details about classes and friends and her growing interest in sustainable technology. We spent 5 minutes talking about our daughter with the shared affection of parents who'd succeeded at their most important job regardless of their personal failures. The elevator arrived again, and Sarah stepped aside to let me board. As the doors closed, she said it was good to see me looking well, that she hoped I was happy. I told her the same thing, and meant it. The brief encounter felt like closure I hadn't known I needed, a chance to see that the people who disrupted my life weren't monsters but humans making complicated choices with imperfect information. During the drive home, I thought about forgiveness again, about the difference between condoning harmful behavior and releasing yourself from the burden of carrying resentment. Sarah had made choices that hurt me deeply, but she'd also given me Emma and years of partnership that had taught me valuable lessons about love and commitment. The pain she'd caused had led to growth I might never have experienced otherwise. That evening, I called Emma to tell her about the unexpected encounter with her mother and Michael. Emma listened with the emotional intelligence she'd developed from navigating complex family dynamics, asking thoughtful questions about how the meeting had felt and whether it had stirred up difficult emotions. She said she was glad we could all be civil with each other, that it made her life easier when the adults in her world could interact without drama. Emma mentioned that she'd been thinking about our family's story, about how the divorce had initially felt like a disaster, but had ultimately led to healthier relationships for everyone involved. She said she'd learned more about authentic love from watching me build a new life with Lisa than she ever had from observing the performance Sarah and I had maintained during our final years together. The observation struck me as remarkably mature for someone who was barely 20 years. That's her person or spercent, but settled 20 years. She said she'd learned more about authentic love from watching me build a new legislature. Emma had been forced to develop wisdom beyond her years, but she'd used that wisdom to become more compassionate rather than more cynical. She understood that love could take many forms, that families could reconfigure without losing their essential bonds, that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself rather than something you owed to people who'd hurt you. After talking with Emma, I called Lisa to tell her about the afternoon's unexpected developments. She listened without judgment, asking questions that helped me process the experience rather than trying to minimize its significance. She understood that encountering your ex-wife and her new husband was complicated territory, regardless of how much healing had occurred. Lisa said she was proud of how I'd handled the situation, maintaining professionalism and dignity, while being open to human connection. She reminded me that growth was measured not by the absence of difficult situations, but by how we responded when those situations arose. Today had been a test of the emotional work I'd done over the past 3 years, and I'd passed with grades that would have been impossible during the immediate aftermath of the divorce. We made plans for the Sedona trip, choosing trails that would challenge us without being overwhelming, booking a hotel that specialized in romantic getaways for couples who preferred hiking boots to spa treatments. The planning felt hopeful, like two people who trusted their relationship enough to invest in shared experiences that would create new memories. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, the kind of deep rest that comes from resolving tension you didn't realize you were carrying. The encounter with Sarah and Michael had provided unexpected closure, a chance to see that the chapter of my life they'd defined was truly finished. They were living their story now, dealing with the complexities and compromises that came with the choices they'd made. I was living mine, building something sustainable with someone who chose honesty over excitement, partnership over passion, steady growth over dramatic transformation. Lisa and I were creating a love story that prioritized foundation over fireworks, the kind of relationship that could weather storms because it was built on bedrock rather than sand. The next morning brought a new work week and a fresh perspective on the life I'd constructed from the pieces of the old one. Emma was thriving in college, pursuing studies that would help her make the world more sustainable. Lisa was making a difference in her students' lives while bringing joy and stability to mine. Sarah seemed happy in her new marriage, living the urban sophisticated lifestyle she'd craved. Everyone had gotten what they'd wanted, eventually, though the path had been more complicated than anyone had planned. The family we'd been had evolved into something different but not necessarily worse, just more honest about its actual structure, and more realistic about its limitations. Love had survived the transformation, taking new forms that served everyone's needs more authentically. I started the truck and headed toward my first appointment of the day, ready to fix someone else's climate control problems while appreciating the comfortable temperature of my own life. The morning was clear and cool, promising another day of work that mattered and relationships that were built on truth instead of convenience. Some repairs took years to complete, but the results were worth the patience and effort required to do them right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.